Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Good evening. I'm Arthur Johnson, Provost of the University of Maryland-Baltimore County, and we're delighted to have you here today. The Concord Coalition has been touring the country delivering this presentation, and tonight's event represents its only stop in Maryland. We're delighted to have a number of guests from the federal government, especially the Social Security Administration. I also want to thank our sponsors who have made today's events possible: the Erickson Retirement Communities, the National Investment Center for the Seniors Housing and Care Industries, otherwise known as NIC, and the Concord Coalition, who's represented by many of our panelists and guests tonight. UMBC is a research university with strengths in public policy, especially health policy and aging studies and human services, and many of the social sciences. One of our priorities is to train students for careers in public service. We do so through innovative undergraduate and graduate programs, such as the Sondheim Public Affairs Scholars Program, inspired by community leader Walter Sondheim. The program is for undergraduates who wish to pursue careers in public affairs. Our Shriver Center also offers a number of opportunities for internships and service learning in the community and throughout this region. One special program is its Peace Worker program, which is a graduate program for those who have completed their Peace Corps service. We also offer master's and PhD programs in public policy, an interdisciplinary graduate program for those already in public service and those preparing for such fields. I want to welcome all the students who are here tonight. This is the type of event that we're proud to offer you as part of your education, also part of just being a citizen of this state and nation. And we're proud of our faculty, many who work closely with the federal government or who have served short periods of time with federal agencies or who came to us from federal government. We're happy to have, for example, Joe Gribben with us. He's serving as a faculty member and advisor with the Erickson School while on loan from the Social Security Administration. Scott Farrell, who is chair of our economics department, was formerly chief economist for the GAO. And Associate Professor Kathy Sealy-Radke was one of 6 Jefferson Science Fellows working with the U.S. State Department in 2006. That is a very prestigious award that is competitive nationwide, and she was one of 6 to receive it last year. And we have Roy Myers sitting to my right, who came to us from the Congressional Budget Office. He is a professor of political science and directs the Sondheim Public Affairs program. Roy's research on the budget has won national recognition, and he'll serve as moderator tonight. Roy?
Thanks, Art. Before I do the introductions, I want to say the relatively large committee of faculty and staff worked on putting this together. I want to thank you all for coming to live up to our hopes. But I want to mention 3 people I think deserve extra praise for doing this. Number 1, Joe Gribben of the Erickson School has really done a fantastic job setting this all up. And in addition, Jill Feinberg and Lynn Guba of Institutional Advancement have made all the arrangements that really made this work. So I'd like to thank them all. To start the introduction, I wanted to read a quote from Anthony Cordesman, who is a U.S. defense policy expert. He returned this summer from a trip to Iraq, and he reported that, quote, "The U.S. does not have good options in Iraq, and that the U.S. can only achieve even moderate success by a sustained search for the least bad option." He then observed that these are unpleasant realities for a nation that prefers all of its solutions to be simple and short. Now, Cordesman's last observation appears to be accurate with regard to federal budget policy. As a political scientist, I often look at public opinion surveys on the federal budget, and they often show that majorities of the public simultaneously favor low taxes, high spending, and a balanced budget. And unfortunately, many voters are encouraged to take such inconsistent positions because candidates for elected office do the same. Our guests today, the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, in contrast, are educating the public about the complicated and vital issue of our unsustainable fiscal policy. This is not the only worrisome issue we face. I can think of at least climate change, immigration, international conflict, inequality in the United States, and healthcare access and cost control, and I'm sure many of you will have other issues that concern you just as much. As with Iraq, none of these solutions to these challenges will be simple and short. All of them, however, are intimately related to the federal budget. Today, our four experts will describe projections of future budget difficulties and suggest what we might do in response. You may observe differences in their diagnoses and prescriptions, or you may disagree with their positions. If so, I encourage you to ask questions following their presentations, and I'm sure our guests will be more than happy to engage in a dialogue. In fact, they have relatively short presentations, so we can have as much dialogue as possible. After the formal session, please join us at a reception across the way in the ballroom lounge of the University Center, where there will be, if not a free lunch, at least free refreshments. Now, in alphabetical order, our experts are, first, Robert Bixby. Bob is the executive director of the Concord Coalition, where he's worked since 1992, when Concord was founded by Senator Warren Rudman and the late and missed Senator Paul Tsongas. The Concord Coalition is the leading public advocacy group for prudent federal budgeting and the organizer of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. Bixby has a law degree from George Mason and an MPA from Harvard. Stuart Butler, at the other end, is Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He is widely viewed as one of the nation's most creative and influential policy analysts. He was instrumental in creation of enterprise zones and is the leading voice for expanding healthcare coverage with consumer choice. Butler has a doctorate in American economic history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Douglas Elmendorf is senior fellow at the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. He specializes in macroeconomics and fiscal policy and has held important positions at the Fed, the Council of Economic Advisors, and at the Congressional Budget Office. So I guess I'm a little biased towards your presentation, Doug. His research has explored the risks of federal deficits and described the increased volatility of household income during the past 3 decades, a very important social issue. Elmendorf has a PhD in economics from Harvard. And finally, David Walker is the 7th Comptroller General of the United States and the head of the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. He is now completing the 9th year of his 15-year term. And as someone who studied the GAO, in fact, I read books about it, I have to say he's well on the way to earning a reputation as one of the greatest Comptroller Generals. During his tenure there, he is more than willing to call it as he sees it. In particular, under his leadership, GAO has notably expanded its ability to address long-range and cross-cutting issues. Walker's a CPA, a certificate holder in senior management from Harvard, and the recipient of numerous honorary doctorates. Prior to becoming Comptroller General, he was Global Managing Director of Human Capital Services Practices at Arthur Andersen and a public trustee for Social Security and Medicare. So the 4 panelists will give their presentations, then I will come back and point out to questioners, and there will be 2 professors, Professor Gribben, Professor Farrell, walking around the room with microphones. Bob?
Well, this is a political season. We're heading into a political year, political election, so let me begin by assuring you that none of us is running for anything. That will probably be clear as we progress through our presentations. You'll understand why. But we are here, and we've been going around the country. This is our 24th state, because we do believe that for the American people, one of the key criteria in judging, assessing candidates for president or Senate or Congress ought to be whether or not they appreciate the magnitude of the fiscal challenge that our nation faces, and whether they appreciate the need for trade-offs in finding solutions, and whether they appreciate the need to start sooner rather than later in addressing the problem. And I'd ask you to keep that in mind as you think about the upcoming elections and assess your choices. Now, if you've been following the federal budget closely, and I'm sure everybody has, you would have heard some good news recently. Fiscal year 2007 closed, and for the third year in a row, revenues were up and the deficit was down. So a logical question is, why are you running around the country issuing this fiscal wake-up call? Aren't things getting better? Well, the reason that we're doing this is that we're not looking in the rear view mirror, we're looking ahead. And when you look ahead, it doesn't take a crystal ball to see that we've got some problems on the horizon. I'd ask you, we're about to undergo an unprecedented demographic shift in this nation to an older society. And we're doing that against the backdrop of rapidly rising healthcare costs and rapidly falling, or at least stagnant, national savings. And that's a very dangerous combination for the future health of the economy. Let me get you to focus on three factors right now, just to start off. Three programs in the federal budget, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, the three biggest entitlement programs, already consume 42% of the budget. Now remember that the baby boomers don't begin to retire until next year. Now add to that the demographic pressures that will come to bear on the budget and the economy. Over the next 25 years, the percentage of people in the population aged 65 and over is scheduled to go from about 12% where it is today to around 20%. That alone will add pressure on the federal budget for these big three entitlement programs, which already comprise 42% of the budget. But demographics is far from the only problem. More importantly is rising healthcare costs. Healthcare costs have consistently outpaced the economy for the past 40 years by about 2.5% annually. And if that same trend continues over the next 40 years, that is to say, if healthcare costs continue to rise faster than the economy at the same pace for the next 40 years as they have over the past 40 years, just two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, would cost as much of our nation's resources as the entire federal budget does today, which is about 20% of GDP. Now, other speakers will talk about what all this portends for the future. I'd like to drop back and just give you a little bit of an overview for sort of Budget 101 on where the federal budget looks like right now. Now, these are the final year numbers for fiscal year 2006, so they're right now a year out of date, but we won't have the final numbers for 2007 for a little while. But things won't change that much. The thing that I'd ask you to pay particular attention to here is the number on top of the spending column. That is net interest. Now, the federal government, like anybody else that borrows money, has to pay interest on what they borrow. And the federal government's interest charges for last year were $227 billion. Now, it's 9% of the federal budget. It was the fastest growing category of the federal budget. And it's just to give you an idea of, for comparison purposes, it was much more than was appropriated for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was more than the federal government spent on its share of the Medicaid program. So it's a very large sum of money. If people say, gee, deficits don't matter, well, why are we spending $227 billion, 9% of the budget, on interest? keep that number in mind, the interest cost, as you look at where some of these trends are going. So, unfortunately, before we get to the unfortunate part, here's the part that's not that bad. One way that people tend to look at this, economists tend to look at this, instead of looking at just the dollar figures, a better way to look at it is how revenues and spending stack up against the total size of the economy. So you'll hear a lot about revenues and spending as a percentage of GDP, and that's what that means. By coincidence, we're right now at about historical levels over the past 25 years or so. Revenues at about 18% of GDP, spending at about 20% of GDP. But those trends are not going to, this pattern will not hold. So unfortunately, the short-term good news does not represent a fundamental change in the problematic long-term outlook. Changing course is going to require some politically difficult choices about programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and that's where the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour comes in. Now you all know the fellow on the horse. That's Paul Revere. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, so I know Paul Revere pretty well, and this is the Concord Coalition after all. But I show Paul Revere because he's symbolic of this effort. We're not running around preaching gloom and doom. We are trying to spread an alarm, and we're trying to do so because we have faith that the American people and their elected officials, if informed about the facts and the consequences and some of the potential solutions, can put aside some of their partisanship and self-interest to think about the right kind of solutions. Members of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour do not all agree on the right mix of spending, taxes, and debt. In fact, that's one of the important messages of the tour, is that we do have different perspectives on the solution, but we all agree that the current fiscal policy is unsustainable, that there aren't free lunch solutions here. We should cut waste, fraud, and abuse, to be clear. We should do everything we can to grow the economy, but we're not going to grow our way out of this problem, and this is more than cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. Finding solutions is going to require bipartisan cooperation and a willingness to consider all options, and that means no preconditions. We obviously believe that public engagement is important. This can't be a matter of backroom deals. But most importantly, we all agree that this is fundamentally a moral issue. This is not just some green eye shade thing. It's not just about numbers. It's a legacy issue. It's about what we are going to be leaving to future generations. And what we should be leaving is a better future, not one that appears to be burdened by debt. Now, there's no better generational steward that I know of than our next speaker, the Comptroller General of the United States, David Walker, who was recently described in the Washington Post as the rock star of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. Now, I don't know about you. My father is an accountant. I know a lot about accountants and CPAs. I've never heard them described as rock stars before, but in this case, I think it applies. So I give you our next speaker, the Comptroller General, David Walker.
While they're getting at the presentation, it's good to be up in the Baltimore area. And while I don't consider myself a rock star, I will tell you that I was born on the exact same day, month, and year as the rock star Sting. And as Comptroller General of the United States, when you're effectively the Auditor General, Sting's not a bad nickname for an Auditor General. You know, we sting people all the time. All right, let me take you from where we've been to where we are to where we're headed. 40 years ago, based upon final audited financial statements, which was 2006, 40 years ago in 1966, 43% of the federal budget was for defense, and 1% was for Medicare and Medicaid. Fast forward 40 years, the 20% was for defense, and that counts Iraq, Afghanistan, and the quote-unquote global war on terror. And I put that in quotes because Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. That's a different story. 19% of the federal budget was for Medicare and Medicaid. 40 years ago, when Congress came to Washington, south of here, they got to decide how 2/3 of the budget would be spent. 2006, down to 38%. Stated differently, 62% of the federal budget was on autopilot. Now, what's in discretionary spending? You might be surprised, especially if you've read the Constitution of the United States any time lately. National defense, homeland security, judicial system, Congress of the United States, Executive Office of the President, State Department, which is foreign policy, and the Treasury Department. All of the major express and prescribed functions for the federal government under the Constitution, and yet these are getting squeezed every year. The federal government has 3 deficit numbers. I wouldn't say it has 3 sets of books, but it does have 3 deficit numbers, and guess what? No surprise, elected officials want to talk about the least bad number, or the lowest bad number. These are in billions, so you have to add 9 zeros to the right of the number. In 2006, it was $248 billion net cash deficit. This past year, 07, the preliminary number is 163. But for both years, you have to add 170 to 180 billion plus, because we spend every dime of the Social Security surplus on other government operating expenses, and we replace it with a bond that has legal, political, and moral significance, but no economic significance whatsoever. In fact, if you did the same thing with a private sector company that the federal government does with Social Security and Medicare, you would go to jail. And I can say that because I used to be Assistant Secretary of Labor for Pensions and Health and used to enforce the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. You would go to jail. Now, in 2006, that means the real cash-based operating deficit was $434 billion, and this year, the real cash-based operating deficit is over double what's coming out of Washington. That's the truth. Between 2000 and 2006, the total liabilities and unfunded commitments for Social Security and Medicare alone, the difference between what the federal government has promised for Social Security and Medicare and the dedicated revenues that it has in the form of payroll taxes and premiums to deliver on those promises, the difference discounted back at Treasury rates went up from 20 trillion to 50 trillion in 6 years. That means you would have had to have, at September 30, 2006, $50 trillion of spare cash laying around that you could invest and get a Treasury rate of return in order to deliver on those promises. But guess what? That $50 trillion is going up $2 to $3 trillion a year by doing nothing. In fact, the preliminary number for 07, $53 trillion. Now, how do you compare $50 trillion as of 06 to some other benchmarks as of 06? Well, that was 95% of the estimated net worth of every American household in 06. It was $440,000 per household in 06. Median household income, believe it or not, in America, less than $50,000 a year. So that means the typical American household had an implicit mortgage of 9.5 times their annual income, but unlike a typical mortgage, no house to back the mortgage. Now, in January of 2001, this is what our fiscal future looked like. The line represents federal spending as a percentage of the economy, so inflation's taken out. The line represents federal revenue, I apologize, as a percentage of the economy, so inflation's taken out. The bar represents federal spending as a percentage of the economy, so inflation is taken out. When the line is above the bar, that's called a surplus. We used to have those, but we don't have to worry about those anytime soon. Now, you can see we had fiscal sustainability for 40-plus years, but in fairness, at that time we were taxing at about 20.4% of the economy, and the highest in the history of the United States has never been more than 21%. So we were taxing at higher levels. Now we're taxing at about 18.5. This is where we stand today. If you assume that tax levels will be at roughly the historical level, about 18.5 over time, that we won't reform Social Security and Medicare, that discretionary spending, which includes all those items I talked about, grows by the rate of the economy, and if we just debt finance the difference, which is what we're doing now, to where the interest compounding grows over time, this is what we look like. The model that drives this simulation implodes, crashes right after this time frame. Now, this is not just a federal problem. State and local governments, including Maryland, have their own challenges going out into the future for several reasons. One, Medicaid cost. Number two, unfunded retiree health care for state workers and local workers. Number three, underfunded pension plans for state and local workers. And number four, deferred maintenance on critical infrastructure like bridges, roads, water and sewer systems, and needs to expand those systems over time. So our real national problem is the lower one, which is worse than the federal problem. So the bottom line is the status quo is not an option. We can't grow our way out of this problem. Anybody who tells you that, one, hasn't studied economic history. Number two, probably is not very proficient at math, because the math doesn't come close. So what do we need to do? First, truth and transparency about where we are and where we're headed financially and fiscally. More public education so people are more informed and involved. More metrics on what's working and what's not working with regard to federal government programs and policies. Reimpose tough budget controls like we had in the 90s. It took us from deficits to surpluses. They expired in 2002, and now we are where we are. And to reform Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, ultimately our entire health care system, to reform our tax system, and to basically redesign government for the 21st century. Guess what? The United States, the only superpower on the face of the earth today, on a broad range of outcome-based statistics on health care, environment, finance, education, etc., ranks number 16 out of 28 as compared to major industrialized nations. As a certified public accountant, I can tell you that 16 out of 28 is officially below average. We can and we must do better, and the sooner we get started, the better, because as Albert Einstein said, the most powerful force on the face of this earth is not nuclear power, it's the power of compounding. And when you're an investor, it works for you. When you're a debtor, it works against you. And when you've got a large and known and growing problem, the sooner you get started, the better off you are. Because if we don't, you young people in this crowd will pay off this bill with compound interest. What is going on today is the federal government is spending more than it makes, it's charging the national credit card, and is expecting our kids, our grandkids, and generations yet unborn to pay it off with compound interest. It's not just about numbers, it's about values, stewardship. You're supposed to leave the country not just better off, but better positioned for the future. And the baby boom generation is failing on that, not just with regard to fiscal, but environmental and several others. That needs to change, and I'm going to have to try to, and I'm going to do my best to change it along with my colleagues. And last, it's about people. These are my grandchildren. I got married at 19. I've been married to the same woman for 36 years. We have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. These grandchildren are obviously too young to vote. They didn't create this problem. This is their problem. They don't have a voice. Their granddaddy is their voice. Thank you.
Well, Dave's always a hard act to follow. I'm very happy to be here tonight with you. My role on this panel during the prepared remarks is to speak about why budget deficits matter, why you should care about the imbalance between spending and revenue, why we shouldn't just put the problem off, why we should tackle it now, what the costs are of living with budget deficits. What I'm going to say I don't think is controversial among economists or policy analysts, but I also think it is not well enough understood. The key problem with budget deficits is that they reduce our nation's saving. Lower national saving reduces our future standard of living. That's basically it. Let's look at some numbers. This is in 2006, a year when you've heard the budget deficit was not a particularly bad problem by historical experience or at all relative to what we will see in the future. 2006, American households saved about $40 billion. Seemed like a lot of money, but it was only 0.5% of households' after-tax income. Businesses saved a bunch more. State and local governments saved some, mostly in retirement funds for their employees. But of the total saving of households, businesses, and state and local governments, the federal government borrowed nearly half. So even in a year when the budget deficit was not too different from our historical average, it consumed nearly half of the saving of everybody else in the economy. And indeed, national saving in the last few years, relative to GDP, has been lower than at any time in our history since the Great Depression. So what happens when we save less? Well, just as for individuals and families, when the nation saves less, we have a little better life today, but a worse life in the future. We're consuming today, but we're not putting the money aside that would help us consume tomorrow. And because saving earns a rate of return, the power of compound interest we've been discussing, when you consume today and don't save, you're giving up a good deal of extra consumption in the future. You're accepting a lower standard of living. Let's see just how that's happening to us. In the absence of budget deficits, what happens with saving? It's used to finance investment in business, plant, and equipment, in housing, and inventories, and other aspects of our capital stock. If we save less, or we borrow a large share of that saving through the federal government, what we're doing is to reduce the money available for investment. We either need to cut investment, or we need to borrow the extra funds from outside the country, or some combination of those two. But let's see which it's been. This is the same numbers I showed you a moment ago, but I've added 2 lines at the bottom. So from net national saving of $252 billion, we borrowed $776 billion from people overseas and governments overseas, and did net investment of about $1 trillion. That investment number is only a little low by our historical standards. Those points at the end of the picture, as you can see, are a little below the average of the last 50 or 70 years, but not very much. So if our national saving is way below our historical average, and investment is only a little below our historical average, what's making up the difference? Well, naturally, we have greatly increased the borrowing we're doing from abroad. We're not saving enough to finance the investment that's being done here, so we borrow the funds from overseas. Now that's better than not investing. If we don't invest at all, we don't have the business equipment that our workers need to work with. They'll be less productive, wages will be lower. So investing is better than not investing. But investing using foreign money is not the same thing, not at all the same thing, as investing using money that we have saved ourselves. Let's see why. If foreigners fund our investment, if we are borrowing from foreigners to do the investing that we're doing, foreigners will receive the return, the interest, dividends, profits on the investment they finance. That's not the fault of the foreigners. Again, it's not that we wish they weren't here doing that. It just emphasizes that if they're doing the saving to fund the investment, they'll get the return from it. Their future standard of living will be higher, but ours will not be. A second effect is the trade deficit is larger. As foreigners bring their capital into this country, that pushes up the value of the dollar, makes it more difficult for us to export because exports are more expensive, makes it easier to import because imports are less expensive. So we import more and export less. A third consequence of this borrowing from abroad that we're doing is that we are vulnerable to what I call here a crisis of international confidence. If foreigners, and this can mean foreign individuals or foreign governments, decide to send less capital to this country to invest here, that would bring down the value of the dollar. It would bring down the stock market, the price of bonds. It would push up interest rates. It would reduce investment. Those changes are changes we can manage if they happen slowly. But we've been reminded this summer that financial markets can change very rapidly. They can move from excessive optimism to excessive pessimism, from too much confidence to too much fear very quickly. And if that happens, with regard to our borrowing from abroad, the disruptions to the economy would be very large. Now, apart from the problems I've discussed that relate to too little saving, there are some other consequences of budget deficits, some other reasons why it is a very poor choice on our nation's part to put off dealing with these problems, to let deficits mount further. The first, as was already been noted, is we pay a lot in interest already, and that number will rise every year we have more debt. A second problem is the deficits reduce the discipline of the budget process. Ultimately, in the long run, any spending that we want to do through the government must be financed through taxes. But if we don't balance the budget each year or every 5 years or 10 years or something close to that, then we're allowing ourselves to raise spending that seems good without deciding if it's really worth the extra taxes. And we're allowing ourselves to cut taxes where that seems good without deciding there's any spending we're really willing to give up. A third problem is that deficits reduce the government's flexibility to address future contingencies. Obviously, if you're in a hole already, then there are fewer steps you can take if serious problems arise. A fourth problem is that deficits raise uncertainty about future policies. We know that ultimately we will have to confront the imbalance. The longer we wait, that doesn't reduce the problem, it increases the problem, and it also means that people can't make plans to respond to the changes in government taxes or spending. That uncertainty hovers over them. Households and businesses can't make decisions for their own sake as well because they won't understand what's coming from federal policy. So I want to close with a temptation to wait and the cost of waiting. Most of the problems I've described build up gradually. We could run up debt for another year, another 5 years, another 10 years, perhaps longer. Unless we have a sudden crisis of international confidence, we may avoid any crisis. But every extra year of deficit takes a bite out of our future standard of living. And cutting deficits is more difficult if we wait, partly because the amount of debt and the interest payments rise, so the numbers are harder, and partly because the longer we wait, the harder it is to change policies. When we talk now about Social Security, people often say, well, we can't change benefits for people who are very close to retirement age because they've already made their plans. They've done their saving or not. So the longer we wait, the more of the commitments that are written into current law will become ingrained in people's decisions. And the harder and less fair it will be to take those benefits away or to raise taxes at that point. So although it is tempting to wait, it is very dangerous. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Which is forward. Okay. Thank you. When I see an audience of this average age, I think maybe that instead of calling this a fiscal wake-up tour, we should call it the fiscal guilt trip. And that's because most of us on this panel, at least, are guilty in the sense of being part of the baby boom generation that has very successfully, over the last 40 years, voted itself huge benefits and passed the tab to you. So we're very grateful for that. But the average cost of all this, as you know, your share is about $170,000 for each of you. So add that to your student loans and so on, you get an idea of kind of what the picture looks like. Well, let me just start by looking again at what this picture actually is. And these are the same numbers, essentially, that Dave Walker and others use to show you the tsunami of expenditure on these major entitlements programs coming through. The red line shows you up to the halfway along sort of what's happened in the past, and then the straight line shows you what would happen if you kept the level of taxes we've been used to in this country, just over 18% into the future. This is the kind of picture that if we were on the Daily Show, probably Jon Stewart would go at this point, or something like that. How can this happen? Well, you have to think about the situation like this, about what the options are. Well, one option, of course, would be to do nothing and to allow the deficit to go up to stratospheric levels, as the kind that Doug explained would be problematic. A second, of course, would be to push up taxes way beyond the existing and the historical level. And the third would be to do something to start thinking about these entitlements, whether we should do something different. Well, let me start by looking at the one option. My job here is to kind of look at these options a little bit and just share some thoughts with you about each of them. First of all, if you look at what is the situation under current law, in other words, if we do nothing with regard to current law with regard to taxes, then basically what we see is within a very few years, the level of taxes as a proportion of the average paycheck, or GDP, you might call it that way, would actually go up to the highest level in history, and then way beyond that up to almost 24%, up from 18% today. That would mean that for those of you in college now, by the time you retired, you'd be paying roughly 2/3 more in taxes than today, than somebody the same age today. Even if we were to extend the Bush tax cuts, and whether or not you like that or not, the fact is that doesn't make a lot of difference. Even with that, we're still talking about going up to historically high levels in the future and a general upward trend. It's only if we extend those tax cuts and deal with this concern called the alternative minimum tax, which is a way of capturing more taxes from people at the upper level, do you actually see anything approaching the current situation, the current level of historical level of taxes? And so when you look at this, it's important to understand some things about it. One is that under current law, taxes as a proportion of GDP are already going up dramatically compared with our previous history. In addition, it's important to recognize that in order to keep the historical level of taxes, we would have to have what in Washington would be called a massive tax cut just to keep it at the same level as we've experienced for recent years. Well, now let's say, on the other hand, we were to raise revenues, raise taxes, so that we could afford all the entitlements, not touch the entitlements, and actually balance the budget over the long term. Well, then in that case, you would see taxes going up from about 18% today to roughly 30% at the federal level. Add on state and local taxes, which is about 10 or 11%. And by the time you reach close to retirement age, we'd be talking about a level of taxes in this country which would be very similar to what we see throughout Europe right now. And we'd have to at least consider whether we would have the same level of growth that we have today, or more like the growth that we see in Europe traditionally over many, many years. Well, what would this mean in terms, I've given you averages and so on, what would this mean in terms of actual tax rates, marginal tax rates that you pay on the last dollar for different situations and for different levels of income? Well, the Congressional Budget Office, which is actually headed up by an alumni of the Brookings Institution, and therefore is in good hands, they were asked what would the rates have to be to get that average with the different levels. And as you see in the handout, we're talking about massive increases in marginal tax rates for people like you if we try to solve this by getting the deficit under control by raising revenue in that situation. And it strikes me that if we're going to go down this route, you've got to at least ask yourself some questions. And I would say 3 questions particularly you've got to think about. The first is, would levels of taxes at this rate, these kinds of levels of taxes, do you think they would cause any harm to the economy? You've got to think about that. The second thing you've got to think about is if we sent more money down the street to Washington, these kinds of levels of increases of revenues, do you think that they would use that money to reduce the deficit and the burden on you, or do you think they would use it to spend on new programs? I would submit to you that if you think they're going to use it to reduce the deficit, you're probably one of those people that thinks professional wrestling is real. And then the third question I think you've got to ask yourself, just as a sort of conceptual question, if the problem today is that we in the baby boom generation have set up things so that we're going to borrow money from you and for future generations, is the solution to borrowing money, if that's immoral, to borrow money from future generations, is it somehow now becomes moral to raise the taxes, to take the money from future generations? And I think so when you look at the revenue side of the equation, you've got to at least think about those things, and you can come down on different sides of that. On the other hand, if you start thinking about dealing with the entitlement side and reducing those, you've got to do some pretty tough things. This is not easy either way. And I think when you look at that, it requires really sort of 3 ways to think about it. The first is, as others have said, one of the first things we've got to do is to actually fix the way that Washington actually spends money and to deal with the budget process itself. That right now that Congress does not have to deal, doesn't even have to look at the long-term obligations that Dave Walker showed you when making any decision in the budget process. The only thing that matters in the budget process is the next 5 or maybe 10 years at most. Beyond that, it doesn't even come into the equation in terms of the budget process. So showing the long-term obligations as part of the budget process, full disclosure, as others have said, is critical to changing the political dynamic involved. Maybe requiring members of Congress to explicitly increase the obligation, vote on an increase in that total obligation, up or down each year. It might be a very important way of getting some sanity into the way in which we make decisions. And we might also think about, in terms of the budget process, beginning to do what a lot of other countries have done, which is instead of these open-ended entitlements and budgeting in that way, where all you really do is say you're entitled to this, and we will just find some way of getting the money and spending it, that we put some of these programs onto long-term budgets, 30, maybe 20 to 30-year budgets in areas like healthcare and Social Security, and stick to those and look at ways of keeping them on track. That's essentially what my native country, Britain, does with regard to healthcare, for example, and we could do it here. I think also we've got to clearly make some changes if we're going to get these kinds of numbers under control. Changes in the way that people think about retirement, think about these entitlement obligations. And I think there's some steps that we've got to really consider. And when we go around the country, people really are open to these. One is to look at strengthening basic benefits for people who really need it, but beginning to introduce income-adjusted benefits for people who really don't need such elaborate benefits when they reach retirement. I mean, quite frankly, I'll share some thought with you. Maybe Bill Gates does not need 3/4 of every prescription he will get when he retires paid for like people like you. I think he can handle the cost of these prescriptions, and even people with a bit less money than him. So the idea of phasing in some kind of income-adjusted benefits in Social Security and Medicare, I think is something it's reasonable, it's fair, and it's something we've really got to contemplate. And I think also it's very important to contemplate the idea of retirement itself. When Social Security was put into place, very few people actually lived long enough to collect it. People did not live for many, many years in retirement. When you retire, by the time you retire, you could be thinking about 1/3 of your entire adult life being in retirement and paid for and subsidized by other people. We can't do that. So we've got to think of significant changes in our retirement law, and particularly when you can retire to make to get things to balance. And then finally, if we're going to do that, if we're going to take steps in that direction to rethink these entitlements and to put some limits on them, particularly for people who have got decent income, then we've got to think about ways of enabling, encouraging people to make proper allocation during their working life, if they can afford it, to really deal with those issues, cost issues for themselves during retirement. That means things like encouraging greater savings, maybe having automatic savings at the place of work, maybe looking at other methods of encouraging people to get insurance for health care that would kick in during retirement. These are the kinds of things that you've got to do. So I guess the bottom line that I want to leave with you, and I think we all do really, is to say, when you look at this situation, when you look at the long-term situation, you cannot fix it by tweaking at the edges, by looking for waste and abuse and things like that. You have to rethink what these basic programs will do, and you have to think very hard about what level of revenues you think is fair and adequate and will work economically in this country. And that's why we've got to have a conversation about this. We've got to have an adult conversation, think about it, and make some real decisions in this area. Thank you.
Thanks to all four our presenters. I'd like to call on questioners, but I'd like to ask you to keep your questions short so more people have an opportunity to ask questions.
Based on these statistics that we're seeing, and we've all known it, do you think it was unconscionable for Medicare Part D to be implemented?
Yes. Yes. It was the
Fiscally
most fiscally
irresponsible.
irresponsible act in 40-plus years.
And it's a perfect example of the problem politically, where the full cost of that was never, what did not have to be considered. It was strictly looking at the next 10 years, and even then, they delayed it so it would look less money, and then basically added $8 trillion to your long-term liability. That is unconscionable, but it's also an example of why you have to change the process for making decisions.
I think just a slightly longer answer is that we needed, I think, to have prescription drugs as part of Medicare. We also need overhaul of the Medicare system more generally. The adding prescription drugs was widely viewed by everybody as a thing that would be received favorably. The restructuring was widely viewed as a change that would be viewed unfavorably. Those are a pair of changes one wanted to group together. In the end of the Clinton administration, I was the Treasury Department, we put forward a Medicare reform plan that both added a prescription drug benefit and introduced more competition to Medicare. One can debate whether we had either of those policies right, but they were bundled. And I think that was a very important element of thinking about this that fell by the wayside when the time came to vote. And that, I think, is very, very unfortunate because it really lost an opportunity to get the changes done as part of a package that had a clear positive element as well.
Medicare was in the hole about $19 trillion before the Medicare prescription drug bill was passed. That added another $8 trillion. And, you know, we need to be recognizing the reality. The last thing we need to be doing is digging the hole deeper. We need to step back and we need to have a discussion and debate about what are basic and essential needs in the healthcare area and other areas. Let's define those. Let's try to meet those. And we can. But we can't meet unlimited wants when somebody else is paying for it and that somebody else can't vote.
Considering all the changes and solutions that you proposed, suggested, can you name a main element that needs to occur in order to set your plans for fiscal sustainability into motion in the future? What needs to happen? What's the first step that you would say needs to happen?
Budget controls. When you're in a hole, and we're in a $53 trillion hole, the first rule of holes is stop digging. So you need to reimpose tough budget controls. But even if we impose tough budget controls, we still have to have that $53 trillion hole. And we need to address the biggest deficit the country has, a leadership deficit. And it's really, really important that the next president, male, female, Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, that they make fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity one of their top 3 priorities. That means budget control, Social Security reform, tax reform, health care reform, at a minimum. We have to do that. And they have to be able to work on a bipartisan basis in order to achieve constructive change. And you've got to package things together in order to get people to be able to agree to compromise solutions. If we do that, we can turn this thing around and we can avoid a crisis. But if we don't get that, I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before we'll have one.
I agree that the budget controls are absolutely critical. And it's interesting to compare what's happening, well, actually not happening in Washington, compared with what's happening here in Maryland and in states all around the country, where states are required to show their long-term obligations, their unfunded, teacher benefits and things like that. And states are beginning to confront these things and make decisions. We've done the same with corporate America in the past, because under federal law, they have to disclose the long-term retirement situation and their unfunded obligations. And you get things like you got in Detroit of tough negotiations to try to deal with that issue. That's not happening in Washington. And that's because Washington is not required to do that. Until you put those budget control changes in, so that politicians at the very least have to actually admit what the problem is and vote on it, which they don't have to do today, you're not going to see a dynamic beginning to occur that forces actual consideration of the very things that we've been talking about. So I think that this sort of arcane notion it is, in a sense, but until you get those rules right, you're not going to get the incentives right to then consider the tough decisions and put them into place.
Do you think that a change to the tax policy, for example, using a flat tax or a consumption tax, will be a more effective and fair way to help raise revenue?
Economists have, for many years, talked about some virtues of a consumption tax in terms of taxing what people, or you could think of taking out of the economy rather than the work effort they're putting in. And I think on balance, the evidence suggests that switching to a consumption tax would raise national saving a little. Not a lot, but a little. I'm not a personal fan, and I'll offer a few reasons that you can agree or disagree, might find interesting. One is that it's a mistake to think that somehow ducks the burden. What you care about when you go to work is how much you can buy with the money you earn. Whether the government takes the taxes out before you get the paycheck or when you get to the store can matter for some things like saving. It doesn't change the basic issue that there's a lot of percent of GDP that will or will not flow through the government. Secondly, moving to a consumption tax, if you just add the consumption tax to our existing tax structure, you're adding a whole complicated new tax structure on top of what we already have. We spend a lot of resources, in fact, administering our tax code right now, administering both from the government's point of view, but also from the point of view of individuals and businesses, because it's so complicated. I want to be careful, I think, about complicating that further. If you replace the income tax with a consumption tax, there are, getting from here to there is very complicated. One can write it down on a blackboard, and I've done that in classes I've taught, but doing it in practice is very hard. So I think and then I think the last thing to say is that one wants to think, I believe, about the distribution of the tax burden. We have a progressive income tax. Moving to a flat income tax would be a less progressive system. moving to a consumption tax with the same tax rate and everything would be a yet less progressive system because people with less income spend a larger share of their income than otherwise. So for some of those concerns, and one can fix consumption taxes in various ways, but that makes them more complicated still. So for some of those reasons, I don't actually personally support that kind of tax, but I think the main lesson for this purpose is that it doesn't, a better tax system would let us raise more money at less cost of distorting people's behavior, or let us raise the same money at really less cost of distorting people's behavior. But, and we should pursue that. It doesn't by itself get you around the fundamental choices we're talking about here.
I prepare my own tax return by hand every year without software on purpose. Not because I'm a masochist, okay?
No wonder you're angry, David.
But because, and I just did it. I filed a timely extension, paid all my taxes on time, but filed an extension, which you can do under the law, and I just filed it in early October. But the fact is, I do it because every year when I testify before Senate Finance and Ways and Means, I challenge them to do the same thing. Because if they did it, we would have tax reform within a year. It is mind-numbingly complex. It is a massive bait and switch effort. I paid this year a 16% surtax on top of my regular income tax in the form of alternative minimum tax, and I was not a happy camper when I found out that somebody told me I was going to get all these deductions, but in reality I really don't get all these deductions because I've got to do AMT, and more people are going to be subject to that. I think you have to keep in mind that when you're talking about taxes, there's two issues. What's the right way to go from the standpoint of economic efficiency and individual and class equity? And then secondly, what's politically feasible? Those are different things, all right? And I think over time, rightly or wrongly, I think where we're headed is a flatter, but not flat, more streamlined, simplified income tax with some type of with a consumption tax that might be dedicated or earmarked, e.g. for something like health care on top over time. But the current system is ridiculous.
Well, I use a computer program, and I think I'm probably less likely to go to jail than Dave Walker is.
Believe me, he's more likely, I can assure you.
But I think that's because you control the government. But I think that...
we can take care of that.
The question, you really got sort of two issues, related issues, of course, as we've all said. One is, how do you design a tax system that is likely to be more efficient and so on, more pro-growth and so on. And I'm attracted to the idea of a consumption tax for that reason and so on. So I think tax reform, which we all agree on, is something we've got to move forward on. Then I think the other piece of the equation, which I alluded to in my opening remarks, was to decide, well, let's make some decision about what level of taxes are reasonable. I tried to point out that if you look at current law, we are moving, without doing anything, to levels of taxation that are A, much higher than we've ever had in our country before, and B, I suspect Americans would not agree to. The evidence is very strong on that in terms of people want to have taxes lower, at the lower level, not at these higher levels that you would have to have under current law, or certainly to balance the budget. And that's my view too. So I mean, I think you've got those two things to bear in mind. So I think those who argue for new revenues or revenues as a way of solving this problem, you've got to ask them, what level are you talking about? Are you talking about raising the tax burdens beyond what is even in current law, which some people are? Some people talk about surtaxes and so on top of our current law. Or are you talking about some other level? And what is the level? Because I feel that if you actually ask Americans this, and we do this, and you see this, they are not prepared to accept the kinds of levels that even under current law exist, and certainly increases on current law. And if that's the case, then you've got to confront the entitlement side, or let the deficits go to levels that Doug would find, would be very perplexed about, because he would feel it was, economically disastrous. So these are the kinds of choices. So I think when you look at the tax issue, it's those two parts, the design of it, efficiency, and then what level are we talking about?
Let us thank our guests for their visit to UMBC.